Nev, I just wanted to say what you did back in Arlethan. Thank you. Really, you're a good friend. A really, really good friend.
You helped me as much as I helped you. But you're welcome.
I never had a sister, but, well, you're one to me. And that means a lot.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Furidashi podcast, where I am here with Lauren. Lauren, say hi to everybody.
Hello, everybody. I am indeed physically here.
Well, no, I mean you're both virtually and physically here. You are in a superposition, a podcast superposition.
I am in the podcast nether space when two people are recording side by side, front to front, but digitally through the webcams and the ether.
On opposite sides of the country.
Yes, which this is not what this podcast is about, but
no. So, I mean, I think we actually mentioned it last time that today we are going to be talking about Dragon Age: The Veilguard, which I'll probably just refer to as Veilguard throughout because I find Dragon Age: The Veilguard to be a little clunky to say all the time. But with that in mind, so actually we have like a bazillion things that we want to talk about in relationship to this game. Many things which will be hot takes. Hopefully, though, still analytically grounded the way we always like to do things, because I know one of my frustrations with reading a lot of the discourse surrounding this game is that it was analytically quite shallow, and both negative and positive reviews I found to be just very shallow. But I don't want this to be about me, because between the two of us, Lauren is arguably the much more hardcore Dragon Age fan, going all the way back to the beginning. We've both played all of the Dragon Age games, but it really is her baby, so I want to let her actually guide this discussion because, because
apparently I own this baby.
I'm a feminist, and I want to center women.
Well, thanks for being so heavy-handed, Nicholas.
Yeah. Thank you for educating me, Lauren.
You're absolutely welcome. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I would say it's not so much that Dragon Age is my baby. I do want to go ahead and go on the record that I've never worked at Bioware. I've never even worked at EA. So I've never had any secret information or anything about Dragon Age and Bioware games particularly. I just happened to play both Bioware and Obsidian's take on the Star Wars universe because I was a big Star Wars fan. And so after that, I've just kind of been slowly and steadily pre-games industry and now post-games industry / in games. Just continue to study the evolution of technology, particularly around branching choice narrative as done by BioWare, both in Mass Effect and Dragon Age. And so with that kind of disclaimer out of the way, so you recognize that while I have made games, I have not actually made these types of games at a AAA right quality, which would what BioWare would be. The preview for today's discussion is really going to be in two kind of big parts, and we're both not sure exactly which is going to end up where, but I will tell you what order. And like our other episodes that we used to do in the past when we have these awesome long form discussions, we're just going to record all the way straight through, and you're going to get a 45-minute episode in this kind of part one session talking about Dragon Age, and then you can look over on our Patreon where you can contribute, and then you can get kind of the rest of the discussion over there in part two.
We should plug the Patreon. That's patreon.com/Furidashi, where you can sign up for that and our entire back catalog of Patreon episodes, which is quite substantial at this point. So if that's the thing that you're interested in, including a lot of educational content, head on over, give us your hard-earned cash, and we will give you our very diligently made audio content. All right,
Yay,
back to Lauren. Sorry.
No, thanks, Nicholas. Don't be sorry at all. Yeah. So the first thing that I actually want to talk about is something that we said we'd kind of get away from, which is core combat. The Dragon Age combat has one of its first, like, hated or loved things. Everybody always
Yeah.
talks about it first, so I think that's what we should do. And we are going to talk about it aesthetically, right? So what
Yeah.
has really freshened up, in our opinion, the combat of Dragon Age Veilguard? Second, that's going to lead us straight into the companions, because I think companions are kind of the front runners of all of the combat in Dragon Age, as well as in the
Yeah.
companion system, right? And how that relates to another really popular RPG that we played last year in 2023, which is actually one of our most listened to episodes as well, about
Yeah, it is.
Baldur's
Yeah.
Gate 3. So that's going to be a really interesting comparison. And then, of course, whenever you bring up companions and you bring up Baldur's Gate 3, you're now going to look at the characters, their characterization, and also their fuckability rating.
Are they
Right?
hot? Are they hot?
Are they hot? Yeah. And how do you romance them? And you can't do a Dragon Age game, I think, without talking about the romance and all of the
Yeah.
quests about those companions as well. So we are going to look at the system, the companion system particularly, that is going to still fall in line with the aesthetics. And then finally, this is definitely going to end up in that Patreon episode. We're really going to talk about everyone's favorite character of the Dragon Age games, Solus. So we really want to focus on how the group dynamics.
Everyone here being Lauren, by the way, Lauren's favorite character.
Lauren's favorite character. I will say he was not my first romance interest. I actually was hook, line, and sunk by Cullen Rutherford, if you will. Yeah, that's crazy. Apparently, I date warriors on my first playthrough, and that's what I've decided. Except for anyway, we're gonna get to that later in the episode about
Definitely.
who Lauren dates in the romance section. Where the reason why we want to talk about Solus is we really want to talk about his impact, right, in the story structure, right? I think Dragon Age Veilguard is probably one of the best examples that I've seen of a game that actually focuses the entire cast of characters into a unified whole, where the players' kind of choices are more about influencing the relationships of those around them and less about the player being that hero character. And that is really hard to do. So I highly, highly recommend that you, even if it's just for 1 month, you subscribe to our Patreon so that you can really dig into all of the aesthetic nuances that come with the narrative design of trying to pull this off. And because we are both academics here, there will both be lots of like amazingness about it. I forgot the C word for it. But there will also, compliments. There will also be a ton of compliments, but we also will have some critiques, right? Where things were like, hey, this is where it could have, maybe this is where they fell short, or maybe they ran out of time. Who knows, right? But at the end of the day, this is a celebration of Dragon Age Veilguard, or Dragon Age the Veilguard, which is acronym is DATV. And we're super excited to have you on this journey. So thank you for listening to my huge preamble, because I do think that it's very important with any timestamps that we do that you'll be able to see, right, all of the kind of elements that we're going to talk about.
Yeah. So we want to start with combat. And so for me personally, one of the things that I did is I went back and I reinstalled Inquisition, and I played a bit of I had a lot of saves, so I played the game at like various points, in terms of character progression, just to see like how the combat felt, like how the dialogue interactions worked, just to like refresh my memory. And one of the things that I was really kind of floored by was the fact that like the combat in Inquisition is not very dynamic. It's to be a little mean for a second, it's kind of boring. Like I remember back when I first played Inquisition that I was completely turned off by like the warrior in particular, because the combat was just so slow. And actually some of that slowness, for especially for the warrior, even like lingers here in Veilguard. But across the board, like the pacing is so much faster. Visually, like to be honest, things are just much more interesting. Like there's more sparkles, to put it mildly. But the thing is, like those sparkles and like visual effects actually serve like really important functions, because the thing is, it makes what you're doing in combat legible, and it makes what's happening around you, both in terms of like what the enemies are trying to do to you, and also like the effects that you have opposed upon them, because there's a lot of emphasis in this game on like stacking advantages, stacking like negative effects on the mobs that you fight. And so being able to sort sort of like see that visually as you're playing, especially because the game is much more fast paced than it has been previously, like that is really important. And it's a way in which sort of like these aesthetic qualities, like the visual appeal and like, high color contrast and things like that, then feed into your understanding of how the combat mechanics work. Because a lot of the combat, especially with like the mage who I played through the entire game, mage in Inquisition is kind of a boring class to play. You sort of stand back and you pew pew and you use your abilities on cooldown. That's pretty much it. Whereas in this game, it's much more like there are elements that are proactive and there are elements that are reactive, because there are certain things that you want to set up. So I was an evoker. One of the things that you want to do in order to maximize your damage is you want to make sure that you freeze all the enemies before you use your charge attack, because your charge attack, if you get a certain talent, will automatically crit. And so like there's a lot more thinking that goes into sort of like how you set everything up. And the way in which you see what's going on screen is very important, so that way you can know like, oh, I should do this at this moment because it's going to maximize the damage of this particular attack as opposed to this one.
Yeah. So I really love that we're talking about mage, because I also did play a mage, and I actually have already started my second playthrough of Dragon Age, despite not having actually finished it. So I do want to actually call that out, because I did forget to say that at the beginning here. Is that I have still not finished it. I am, I think, almost 60 hours, and I'm just I'm having a good time. And I did want to mention that, because mage and Inquisition for me was a really fun class, because I really just like sparkly effects.
Yeah.
And I really just like doing a shit ton of damage. I always played a mage, and my second playthrough I played a ranger, which was once again another ranged class. And I think ranged classes for me were way more fun than melee classes. I did try to do a nightmare run with a warrior, and I also did I did a hard run with a rogue that was like double stabbed, backstabbing, double daggers. There we go. I've got this. And I think that for me, Inquisitions really shined, particularly because every single kind of person was self-sustaining. So what this means is that when you died, the game wasn't over.
Yeah.
You chose someone else, you would automatically get revived at the end. But like that character that you now inhabit has to be completely self-sustaining, so self-functional, right? Yeah. The reason why I think this is incredibly important is you can actually see now in Veilguard, they really did away with that. Like the person that you're playing Rook, like if you die, you cannot inhabit your companions. Your companions' abilities, skill sets, and combat maneuvers, while they are reflective of a skill tree, you don't level up their skills. You don't level up anything. Yeah. You actually can't even play them in that way. And I think this really kind of harkens back to a little bit of Anthem, and a lot of with the primer, the detonators, and the whole combat system about how you're playing as a solo character in a party of 3 on a mission, and those 2 other humans, right? You would never embody them. If you die, you die. Right?
Yeah, and the interactions are really important, because in Inquisition, you're essentially talking, it's the classic D&D setup where like you have multiple characters in a party, but they all have their individual skill sets that don't explicitly interact with each other. They may like interact in the sense that like, one character covers for the weaknesses of another. But in this game, in Veilguard, like there are explicit mechanical interactions that you actually have to take into consideration, precisely because, as Lauren mentioned, the primer and detonation system, like that's a lot of damage. And what's interesting is that it then sort of then plays into sort of more thematic choices that you may make about what characters to have in your party. Because like if you want to have a particular like 2 characters that you like but aren't necessarily like mechanically compatible, then you actually have to make that decision over and above the fact that you're actually going to be doing substantially less damage because you don't have those explicit interactions.
Right. And what's really interesting and fascinating about this is, once again, we promised that these were going to be about aesthetic conversations. And like Nicholas is talking here with the thematic element of it, in Dragon Inquisition, you almost always put together your 2 mages, a rogue, and a warrior. Or you always put together the warrior and a mage and then 2 rogues, right? Like you always have a double up, or you have 2 warriors, or you have 4 mages, right? But you're kind of in that Dungeons and Dragons mindset of like, these characters, these roles, I can kind of switch around and play them. And you would think that thematically, then those characters are maybe more individualistic. I've seen a lot of people talk about how like the characters of Inquisition kind of stand out and kind of on their own,
Yeah.
versus the characters in Veilguard feel like they all need to be together. Well,
Yeah.
that's thematic.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
And I think that what's really interesting and fascinating about this is the combat of Veilguard really emphasizes to me more of that kind of heist movie, more of that you all have to work together. You all bring your strengths to create something as a whole, versus an Inquisition, while you did have those good party dynamics, because everybody was just kind of doing the damage to the single targets or multiple targets, right? And I really liked the combat of Inquisition because I am a bit of a hack and slash kind of person.
Yeah.
And so for me, I need that kind of accessibility. I would say that Veilguard has, for me, only improved that further, where it's incredibly accessible, right? Where I could create very individual paths for some of my characters. Since I played a mage, I was not an evoker, so I don't have really any chill damage. So what I did with Nev was Nev cannot prime or detonate really on anybody in my party. She is just a slow and like chill mage. And
Yeah.
then I've got a couple talents to kind of take advantage of that, but more on the affliction side because I was
Yeah.
a Mourn Watch kind of like necromancer. And so I went that route, but then also dipped all the way down into Spellblade because I just wanted to use, once again, I'm a hack and slasher. I just wanted to use light and heavy attacks and crit all the time. So I think that like it's that path of exile skill tree that lets me kind of like take advantage and become a person that works better in this group of individuals versus, right, Dragon Age Inquisition, which is just, oh, well, we're all individuals and we're in a party together.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that while the game encourages you to sort of think about the primer detonation setup between the companions, you can also do that between a companion and your player character. Like your player character can be the one doing the detonating or the one
Oh,
doing primer
I'm
as
the
well.
only person doing that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't actually make my companions do it to each other until like very late in the game. I am in kind of the start of Act 3. I just haven't really done that yet because I wanted to be the one, right, setting up my companions for success. Like that's how I wanted to play. And then only after a while, as they got like cooler hero abilities, and then I like just started deciding to go crazy after realizing that Harding and Neve and myself with no prime detonators just like we took out enemies so fast my jaw dropped. So I was like, actually, maybe I can just sit back and let my companions kind of help me out here. That's good.
Yeah, there's there are some builds where you can get some crazy damage in this game. In fact, there's some builds that I tried that literally hit the damage cap, and I was like, okay,
Oh,
that's a lot. But the thing is that like you can do crazy damage, but crazy damage in this game actually isn't enough. Because I think another important aspect of combat is something that we talk about all the time, which is sort of like the narrative structure of combat encounters. Because there are quite a few combat encounters in this game where, in order to do it successfully, you're not like, in fact, this is especially true of a lot of the boss fights where you're not necessarily confronting the boss directly, and then there are various stages where they do various like different things to you that you have to either avoid or like counteract. But there was one, I'm not going to say explicitly where this happens, but there is one boss fight later in the game where what you need to do as the player character is actually go around the battlefield and rescue your companions so that your companions can contribute the specific thing to the fight that they need to contribute. You actually don't do much confronting of the boss at all. You do damage them from time to time, but there is a setup that you need to perform in order for this boss fight to fulfill its sort of like thematic narrative culmination, because the point is how like is the Veilguard. It's the total like group. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and all of the pieces have to be in place in order for like ultimate victory to be achieved. Whereas like I'm going to go on a bit of a philosophical rant here, but like the proposition that most games make for the player is a power fantasy. It's like you are the most important person in the world. You are the one who has like can change everything to save or annihilate or do like the ultimate thing that will determine the course of history. Whereas the proposition that Veilguard presents to the player, and I think it's actually what fueled a lot of frustrations, even though people didn't really understand this, is the opposite. You are not actually the center of the world. You are one of the pieces. And you have to understand that you are one of the pieces and respond to your companions accordingly, not just outside of the context of combat, but in combat as well, because of the fact that the combat encounters, the most significant ones, the ones that advance the plot, are structured in this way where you have to think about the total picture of how everything is interacting rather than just like maxing your personal damage, because that's not always going to be effective.
Yeah, and I definitely think that as we are trying to avoid spoilers on this one, particularly around how, like, since I haven't finished the game, I will say that for us, like, as we move kind of like from the combat decisions and like becoming the sum of its parts, like, we also want to kind of delve into the companion system
Yeah,
and
definitely.
exactly how the companion system helps kind of reinforce that. Because I think for me, when we talk about actually needing to recognize that you are kind of a part of like the greater whole, like you are just another character, I think you can't. Before we talk about the companions or as we move into the companion system, I want to like call out and remember that like this very much has a soul of Dragon Age 2. I
Yes.
really do feel
Yeah.
like in some shorthands, I basically was like, I love this game even more because I'm playing Dragon Age 2.5. And from even from the like the choice wheel, you can see that in Inquisition they kind of expanded the choices, and it very much was like a you're a blank slate character and you're going to get angry, upset, happy, etc. And we still do see that in Dragon Age Veilguard. But what we actually see is a return to form with the same icons, even of are you a positive response, kind of the snarky response, or more of a straightforward kind of response, like just let me go.
Yeah, more laconic. Yeah.
Right. And I think that what's great about that is that honestly, I have very much like on my current playthrough just kind of done whatever. Like I haven't chosen one path to be like, this is how I want the character to be. And I think it would be unfair for us to say that a kind of three style wheel approach is actually too similar to Mass Effects, which also has that with Paragon, Renegade, and Neutral,
Yeah.
because it isn't at all good guy, bad guy, snarky,
Yeah,
right?
no,
And I
not at
think
all.
what they've really done is evolved what it was from kind of two, which very much was just like, I do want to do like the Chantry says this is bad. And then your positive response would be like, I agree with you, versus in the negative response, like would kind of be, I disagree with you. And you saw that in their companions and relationship system, right? Where you could be rivals with one of your companions and still romance them, or you could be friends, right, with one of your companions and also romance them, right?
Yeah. So I mean, sorry, if you need to finish that thought, go ahead.
Yeah, I have like my culmination of this thought is we see this from Dragon Age 2, and we see this very well executed, I think, much more authentically in Dragon Age Veilguard, where Rook, unlike Hawk, which very much was just like, let's play with relationships of negative and positive, let's make everyone romanceable. Rook, on the other hand, is okay, let's take what we learned from Inquisition, which was these responses are all about a certain type of character, but let's now kind of revolutionize kind of like aesthetically who is Hawk. And
Yeah.
Hawk is someone that, maybe they prefer words over action, or maybe they prefer action over words. And yeah, they're a bit of snarky and they're absolutely bi because everybody in the game is bi, right?
Pansexual.
And
Pansexual, really.
pansexual, truly.
Yeah.
But we do, that's true. It's true. It's not the binary. But they, regardless of what they this isn't a good response is what I'm trying to get. Like option one isn't good.
Yeah.
Snarky is still snarky, right? But option three also isn't a negative response to what any of your companions are saying. In fact, those companion responses are all in favor of recognizing, right? Your companion is going through trouble or the world does need saving. It's just about your approach. And Rook, I think, very much has a central character that was missing, right, from Llewellyn and was missing from the Inquisition kind of character itself, because you were able to kind of self-insert and have that power fantasy.
Yeah.
Versus Rook, you aren't able to have that power fantasy. And so that's a really long-winded way, I guess, of kind of bridging the gap between like combat, right? Where Nicholas is saying the systems and the mechanics are to make you feel powerful, but the boss fights and the encounters are actually thematically to remind you that your companions are kind of just as important and just as individuals.
Yeah. And also those encounters remind you that like the choices that your companions make while influenced by you are ultimately their own. And so if we're talking about the companion system sort of like in toto, one of the things that's really interesting is that Well, one, it's not just about the relationship between Rook and like the specific companion in the same way that like in Inquisition, a lot of the focus is on that sort of like that interpersonal interaction and less on like the interaction between companions, although there is some. Whereas and in this instance, also like the way you interact with your companions, both in terms of like the dialogues that you get, but also like the entire quest line that each companion has, it's much more about, in fact, the game explicitly says this, like your companion, in order to be able to perform at their best in like the larger mission that the game presents to you, fighting these elven gods, they are currently distracted by something that is going on in their life that is difficult for them. And if you help them with it, in other words, if you approach your companions with a sense of care, in a duty of care for them, then they will in turn function far better in terms of sort of like what we were talking about before, that greater whole that thematically the game is trying to present to you. And so you go through these elaborate quest lines where like you're both fighting things, but you're also struggling. Tasha's is a really good example of this, where like there is this chakra to Ebra, is that what they say all the time?
Yeah, chakra to Ebra.
So Tasha's understanding of this is sort of like, in the way that they learned it from their mother, is that like I need to struggle against like my own nature and this way in which I'm different from all other Kunari. But over the course of time, you start to learn that really what that means is sort of like the struggle with yourself is the struggle on behalf of yourself. And the way without spoiling it, the way that quest line evolves over time reflects the fact that what you're trying to do with and for Tosh is to help them get to a point where that struggle for them is a positive thing rather than a negative thing. And if you bring them to that point by spending time with them, both in terms of like developing the bond, because you can't develop the bond between yourself and characters unless you just like spend a lot of time in game with them. And you have to do that. And that's also then reflective of this duty of care. How do you show that you care for people? You spend time with them. Like it's really it's on the one hand very simple, but also because it's very antithetical to the way in which companion systems and a lot of other RPGs operate. It feels very novel, and also I can understand why for some people it was really off-putting.
Yeah, I want to kind of like harken into that a little bit, or harken back to like what you talked about in Inquisition, where I think that's something that a lot of people are struggling with is the pacing of your companion's kind of content in Dragon Age Veilguard versus the pacing of this content, say in a game like Inquisition or even in a
Yeah.
game like Baldur's Gate 3. Because I know Nicholas did want to kind of talk about contrast and comparing some of the ways the companions kind of like level up between the two of them. And so I think when we look at Inquisition, that was very much a people will approve if they're in your party of your actions, they'll disapprove, but also kind of everyone equally would approve and disapprove of your options, particularly around how you decided you wanted to take on the mantle of Inquisitor, right? When you like kind of raise the sword and you're like, this is what I'm fighting for. And there
Yeah.
were very few key elements where like only Solus would approve if you were like, because of for the elves. Right? And I know this because I actually bought this is one thing that it's a bit of a tangent, but I really, really love those nice typed physical hardback books of like game guides because now everything's digital. And when I played Inquisition back 10 years ago in 2014, around this same time, I had a manual that like I would use to help me on like future playthroughs, or if I was a little bit stuck on a boss battle, or like it had all of the maps printed out for me so that I didn't have to look online, right, for everything. Um, anyway, that's my little tangent there that I had a game guide and I really liked the game guide because it would tell you the romancing guide and like actions that they would approve to. And I think that this is contrasted really nicely with Baldur's Gate 3 because on the surface it looks the same. Both your companions need to be in your party if you want to romance them,
Yeah.
right? There are also flirt options for both of them, right? With
Yeah.
really well things. And I think the only thing that it boils down to is that Baldur's Gate 3, for all of its choices and consequences and its kind of open worldness in Act 1 and Act 2, is incredibly linear. And so the pacing is able for you as a companion, if you are as a character, like a player character, and you have like all of your companions, there are still gates and checkpoints you have to hit And it's also possible for you to then hit a checkpoint, but without getting, say, the bool for romancing to be true, to having skipped even being able to romance, say, Karlak, even though she approves and has been in your party, versus honestly, the pacing of Act 2 with your companions, what I've found aesthetically, is that yes, if they're in your party, their bond increases because you fight with them, right? They do approve or disapprove of your actions or things when you have group conversations, but typically they generally always approve because you're on a quest with them and they're required to do that quest. Versus you can complete Cazador's mansion, like you can complete that kind of section completely without Astarion, who then is
Yeah.
just super upset you didn't bring him along, which is great, right? But you cannot do that in Dragon Age Veilguard because this is about helping people and showing that compassion, right? And I think additionally, the reason why though I bring up the pacing, right, is that since it's required to have these people, but you can do it in any order. Really, the only kind of pacing checkpoint
Yeah.
is whether or not you return to the lighthouse. And so it's basically very much a reminiscent of what we found in Anthem, which I know isn't in the Dragon Age timeline, everyone, but it is in the developer's timeline. So we must not forget, right? That we have this sort of like when you come back to a hub base, now you get more quests from people. You go out, you do those quests, you come back to the hub base, you get more quests, right? And it's that pacing, I think, that people find the most struggle with, actually, is they say that, oh, I don't like how the characters do X, Y, and Z, or, oh, these quests are really heavy-handed. But I think it's because then, unlike Inquisition, which all was in one zone, like the hinterlands, and you're there forever and you're kind of completing a zone, right?
Yeah.
This is very much not a zone-based game. It very much is a companion and character-driven base game. And if you do happen to go to a zone and you realize there's new quests there, and you do those quests in that zone, that's great. But you, as the player, are not told, go do all of the quests in those zones because you need to raise your alliance meter. Like, you don't have to do that. You actually don't have to do your companion quest. You can speed all the way to the end.
And it actually has a dramatic effect on the end of the game if you don't. It's like a really serious effect on the way the game ends if you don't.
Oh, I 100% like I know that it will, and I refuse. And that is why I am like almost 60 hours into this game, and I am just at the end-ish in the once you hit this, it's definitely going to be a point of no return.
Yeah.
I've stacked all of the romances. I've already branched my save file so I can like romance every single one of them in these parallel realities. Like it's yeah. Anyway.
So something that you brought up, Lauryn, that I want to circle back to is you mentioned the fact that the way in which the quests, sort of like broadly speaking, are structured, you're constantly having to come back to the lighthouse. And I think that's really important for what we're trying to say about how Rook is sort of like a piece that fits into a larger puzzle. Because instead of the events of the world being driven primarily by the like, and now the all-important character is doing this, and now the all-important character is doing this. The all-important character is actually forced to come back to the hub, not just of like quests, but also the hub of the entire sort of like team, the companion structure. And because the lighthouse isn't just like the place where Rook is, it's where everybody is. Everybody has their room. They're doing things in their room. They're working on their separate projects. And it's structured in such a way where it encourages you to check in with them, even if they're not necessarily going to give you like, the next stage in their particular companion quest. So once again, it's reinforcing this idea that you have to spend time with the people that you're working with. And this sort of leads to a frustration with a constant like refrain that I saw in especially a lot of negative critiques, which is that they didn't feel... Actually, no, I'm not going to refer to this, but because I think ultimately, analytically, we want to look at like what it's doing rather than sort of like responding to people being dumb. I think what's really important here is that in having to constantly come back, and the game is training you perhaps against your will to try and see something that was actually there the entire time in all the Dragon Age games. And I want to refer back to actually in future Nicholas will insert what episode number this was, because I don't actually remember off the top of my head. Well, hello, future Nicholas here. The episode in question is episode 181, and the title is, well, let me look at my notes. Player narrative versus game narrative. All right, back to me. But we have actually talked about Dragon Age Inquisition before on this very podcast. And one of the things that we talked about is the way in which Inquisition, while it doesn't do it perfectly, at least presents the possibility of a different way of thinking about the player character's relationship to what's going on in the rest of the game. And so far from Veilguard actually being like this radical departure from Inquisition, what it's actually doing is drawing to the fore something that was latent. And and while at the same time still struggling with the fact that ultimately it is presenting a bit of a power fantasy, like it doesn't abandon that entirely. And the struggle between those two things, between sort of like the central character is the leader, the one who is ultimately making the final decisions, and the fact that like in order for a particular kind of story to progress, you actually have to you can't just burn through the main quest line. If you do that, you are going to get a version of the story in which, I'm just going to say it outright, your companions will feel slighted because you did. You literally did that. You slighted them. And
Yeah.
that's just being honest.
Yeah. Versus, right, in Inquisition, when we talked about Inquisition, I believe we talked, what I've now kind of phrased was timestamp, as Nicholas has kind of really given us, I think, the next, like, really great segment of this part is about Dragon Age player as the world versus as a character. And I think for me, like, when we look at the narrative of the Dragon Age games, it's really all about you being, right, a crucial piece, like a crux, right? And I think that when Nicholas talks about leadership, right? I was playing this game, and particularly having just been a leader and director at a larger studio with a team of about, the Veilguard size of about 6 or 7 really strong people that were going to go then talk to your context. Let's get this on screen. Well, we can
Yeah.
build quests. Like this is right, instead of building quests, like, instead of doing the quests, we were building them. And I think what's really interesting is that when you have that categorization of Rook, right, as the leader, I very much loved this game because I was like, this is the game like Gen Z, this is the game people need to play because this is what good leadership actually looks like. It's about
Yes.
caring for the others in your team and
Yeah.
making sure that your team members are set up for success.
Exactly.
Not about like being the leader that has like all of the great ideas or is like, I'm going to steamroll through what we need to do to get to the end of the milestone. And I know that I do this every time we talk about any sort of game, but I'm just like, oh, you can just see like the developer, the development process in the games, whether it's combat or it's narrative as well. But I think for me, what really solidified as I picked this title up, and a little bit, some of it I think was heavy handed in the dialogue. But I think the reason really was because they were like, look, this title, this is really the game where every single choice you make, like you're going to get a shitty consequence. Like if you really want to steamroll and speed run this game,
Yeah.
to get to the ending, to play the main story, and I am scare quoting every single one of those.
Yeah.
You can't hear it in my voice. You're not going to get the great game that you want from Dragon Age, right? And I think that's really beautiful because you could really steamroll it in Inquisition. Like, I did not realize I did not do companion quests because I just didn't unlock them for whatever reason. Like, I didn't play with Cassandra enough. I actually completely ignored Blackwall so much that when I got to the end of the game, I forgot I didn't do any of his quests. And his only response to me was just like, he's like, fat load of help I was, though. And that was it.
Yeah.
He literally was just like, you've never played with me. You've never interacted with me. And now we're at a ceremony and you go like, hey, how are you doing? And you're like, do you even care? Like that's literally was his line. And I felt so bad. And so obviously on playthrough 2, I did all of his quests and I actually realized he had history. The point being, right, is that you could still get to the end of the game and experience the same story.
Yeah.
But in Veilguard, they were very heavy-handed in the dialogue and some of the narrative that may have rubbed people the wrong way.
Yeah.
Because they're like, we are not that game. And we have to let you know.
Yeah. So I think if there is one major thematic break with Inquisition, it sort of centers around like differing conceptions of what constitutes maturity and a mature like story or an adult story, so to speak. Because the thing is, and this came, okay, I guess I'll refer to these things. This came up in a lot of criticisms where many people thought of the plot line of Veilguard as being kind of like childish, or not childish but cartoonish, kind of like
Boo.
overspill, like and not gritty, not mature,
Boo.
which actually I'm going to say straight out is it's wrong, because the thing is, when you look at Inquisition, like, yeah, so actually not even Inquisition, going all the way back to Dragon Age Origins, there's something that happens depending on where you start. Because if you start as a mage, like, actually, yeah, if you start as a mage in Dragon Age Origins, spoilers for the beginning of an ancient game, there is a bit that happens in the prologue where you essentially go through this ritual where you either have to you have to
Called
decide,
the
like, yeah, so yeah, so like this really very like kind of fucked up ritual that you have to like take part in, and it's like, oh, it's so gritty and so dark, and you have to make this like really important decision. But the thing is, what Veilguard is presenting to you is the idea that being adult means actually getting along with people. Like, that if you're going to be engaging in, and this is what Lauryn was saying about leadership, like, if you're going to be engaging in a huge collective project that involves a lot of people and needing to get people on your side, you actually can't be picking fights with them all the time. That's actually going to be self-destructive. And that, in fact, to my mind, the kind of person who, I guess, approaches every single interpersonal problem they have in their life by wanting to beat it up, that's the way a teenager responds to it. That's the way a child responds to that. Whereas the way an adult is expected to respond to those situations is that sometimes you actually have to work with people you don't like. You have to get them on your side because their contribution to the whole project is just as important as yours, even if it's a small piece. And the thing is, like, the game reflects this. Veilguard reflects this. So there's an early decision point where, like, depending on the decision you make, one of your companions will get the hardened status, which means that, like, all of the normal, like, bond development and progression stuff like that is actually much harder with that character. It's not impossible, but it's harder. And the thing is, the game is telling you, like, actually, this character is also important. They don't like you because of a choice you made, and now you need to get them back on your side. You actually need to do more work with them. You need to be more understanding. You need to be more involved in what they're doing in order to bring them back around, because that is what a leader does. That is what a mature person does. A mature person is not one who's like sees interpersonal conflict within their team and goes like, yes, I take this person's side and you're an asshole. Like, that actually is self-destructive. The thing is,
Yep.
Inquisition doesn't reflect the fact that that's self-destructive, because it actually, I think, reflects a much more immature approach to how people respond to each other interpersonally.
No, I will say that, like, when Nicholas does say immature, I want you guys to know we did do that episode on Dragon Age Inquisition, and we are just praising it the entire time. So, like, I do want
Yeah.
us to understand that this is all about an academic spectrum, because I also wanted to point out that, like, when we talked about, like, Origins, okay, for the record, Origins also does have an element of this. While it's not the hardened status, it's not reflected both in the systems and the gameplay as much as in the narrative. As someone who wasn't quite an Alistair fan, there was a moment between, once again, this ancient game. There is a moment between Alistair and Loghain, right, where you actually really
yeah.
hate Loghain,
Yeah.
but if you want to side with him for whatever reason over Alistair, basically there's a moment where now you are, right, standing up as a more mature adult and going, okay, I'm going to side with you, Loghain, versus I did not. But I still wasn't quite enough Alistair fan to put him in my party for some reason. He's actually really funny in my party. I don't know why. I just replaced him with the dog. Because that's what I decided to do instead. I just needed something. Once I had Zevran and dog, it was just all
Yeah.
perfect. So Liliana, Zevran, dog, Lauryn. Dalish mage, because I put the Dalish markings on me as well.
Yeah.
Anyway. So I too, right, you have to get along with Alistair, or I won't spoil it, but let's just say Alistair can become a very pivotal character
Yes.
towards the end of the game.
a bit. Yeah.
You know, just a bit, both in terms of, who Alistair is, but also what he could represent into, kind of semi-saving your life in a way. And if he doesn't like you, he just won't do what I needed him to do so that I could live my Antivan Crow life with Zevran in the
Yeah.
future, right? And so I think that that's what's really impactful here, is that we did see this in Origins,
Yeah,
right?
it's
And we
very
actually,
early.
I think, see it. We also see it in Dragon Age 2. I think the rival romance with Fenris is kind of the most like kind of gritty version of it. Or also you can just sell Fenris back
Yeah.
to the Magisters once. Like, you have actually seen this in all of these titles, but I think Veilguard is the one where they finally, it's not just in the narrative, it's also represented by the gameplay and by
Yeah.
the whole characterization. And now it changes how you have to play with that character. Because in my version, the character that I got hardened was actually someone I wanted to romance,
Yeah.
but couldn't because I got a bug and the door wouldn't open.
Yeah.
And so now my second playthrough, well, hopefully I won't get that bug and the door will open. But now I'm basically interacting with the character and having to actually play with them more in my party to improve their bond at a rate in which it was equal to all of my companions. And in fact, I actually not only improved their bond faster because I just included them more in like outings, but I also then ended up completing their quest line first.
Yeah.
And that was just kind of insanely crazy to me, because I was just like, how did this happen? Like, you were supposed to be the one that like, you're going to have to catch up with them. And instead it became like, actually, they're the highest level one for a bit now. So it was really fantastic, right? Because now you're getting that narrative represented, I think, in the gameplay. And it's those kind of like companions that make you realize the player is just a part of the Dragon Age, I think, world and the lore, right?
Yeah.
And not just in that.
Well, and I think because we're coming up on the midway point, I want to emphasize a couple of things. One is that yes, I mean, for me, the argument that I was trying to make is that like all of these things were latent in previous Dragon Age games, and now they are being brought to the fore, mostly as a way to sort of counteract this, I think, fairly facile criticism that it's like this radical departure, because I don't really think it is. I think
Mm-hmm.
people who made this game actually are students of the previous Dragon Age games, and they're drawing upon things that I think actually previously got a little overlooked, even though they're very clearly
Mm-hmm.
there, as Lauren showed. And the second thing is that like actually I love that description that you have of like your own experience, your own player experience, because like for you then leaning into what the game wanted from you actually then transformed your own interaction, like your interaction with these companions as a human being playing the game, not just as sort of like the person who is controlling the avatar who is abstracted from you. Like you finished that quest line first because by spending more time with them, you then wanted to spend more time with them. You saw more of who they are, and you're like, oh, I'm really interested in this character as a person, and I want to sort of develop this. And then suddenly you find that you've completed their quest line first because of that interest, by showing interest, by caring for the companions, not just in a kind of like broad philosophical way, but in a like very specific concrete way. You actually develop your own perception of how the game is to be played, rather than just sort of accept like, oh, I have built in
Mm-hmm.
my mind a way that Dragon Age is supposed to be, and this isn't that, therefore I'm mad. That's how a
Yeah.
baby reacts.
Yeah. And so, with that amazing ending from Nicholas, I want to lead you guys into understanding that I think Dragon Age the Veilguard is one of the most compassionate games that you could play on the market today. And it is a hell of a lot of fun. So, if you guys haven't picked up Dragon Age, in a couple of weeks, it will be Black Friday in the United States. And if you are in the US of A and or probably now everywhere in the world, it may actually end up being a little bit on sale, because EA tends to do this with their games in November. So if you're not going to pick it up at the full retail price or the collector's edition as well, which you should, but if you don't, do remember, like, hey, it'll probably be on sale. Grab it on sale, play this game, and really it is going to be the game that we're going to then talk about in our next audio.